So Lady Brenda, it is fantastic to have you back with us in Queen's. And I recall your portrait unveiling in the Great Hall a number of years ago when you talked about all of your work in Queen's and in particular in QGI.
Yeah.
And I think you shared with us what it was like to have one's portrait painted. But I wonder if today you could cast your mind back 21 years to the time when QGI and the Women's Forum was getting started and share with us what was happening then.
Well, probably I need to go back a little bit before that, because I was one of the very few female members of Senate at that stage. In fact, when I joined the Senate at Queen's, I was one of 5 ladies amongst, I think, 50-something men. So those were the sorts of proportions that Queen's was dealing with in those days. And as a member of Senate, I was on the panel which interviewed Sir George Bain for the post of Vice-Chancellor. And I remember I asked him, if you were appointed to as Vice-Chancellor, what would you do about the gender imbalance at Queen's University? And George looked at me and he said, well, I don't know. I'd never heard of this problem before, but I'd certainly look at it and I'd, try to do something about it. And that was the start of the seed of determination, because George did do something about it. A number of months later, he brought some senior women together, one of whom was me, because I'd asked the question, and I happened eventually then to become his Pro-Chancellor, but I wasn't at that stage. And he asked us to pull women together, a small group of women, and see what we could do about creating a solution to this problem. And I always remember him saying, now don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. But it was very obvious that it was key to his long-term ambitions that he would make a difference in this. I think it was a seed that grew with him as he saw the progress that the Women's Forum, as it then became, was making. But I always remember we put out an email across the university and invited any woman who was interested to come to a meeting in the administrative block. And there were 9 people, including me, and Professor Margaret Mullett, who subsequently became the first director of the Gender Initiative, and Professor Jean Orr, who was vice chair along with me, the lovely Jean Orr. So there was a lot of cynicism at that meeting, because obviously from the women that came along, they said, oh, other people have tried things and this will never work. No, I don't honestly think anything's going to come of it. But we went back to George and said, look, we think there's the beginnings of something here. And the Women's Forum as such was then formed. And George decided that if the Women's Forum was going to go forward, it needed to have a formality, a structure. And he gave us the resources to form an office. I sat on the appointments panel for the first director of the Gender Initiative, your predecessor, Professor Margaret Mullett. And that was the start of progress that, as you can see now, has become embedded in the culture of the university. And we couldn't believe that, if looking forward, I think none of us would have believed where we would be now. It's a very different place and a very different institution.
So one question during an interview sparked a series of questions to Women in Queen's, which then became the Women's Forum, and the development of an office and structures that really have been the foundation for the 21 years of work that have come afterwards. So just thinking of your role in Queen's at the time, what role did you have in the Queen's Gender Initiative as it became? And did your other roles in Queen's help this, or was it coincidental with it?
Oh, no, I think, well, I was involved as Pro-Chancellor initially at a lot of, in a lot of events and different aspects of the business of running the university. But I think when I became Pro-Chancellor, and then after a year or two I was appointed Senior Pro-Chancellor, which meant I chaired Senate, that it did make a difference because people sat up and took notice if you were chairing the Women's Forum and you were Senior Pro-Chancellor and you were Chair of Senate. It meant that you had the ear not only of the Vice-Chancellor but of the Executive Board, of the Registrar and so on. But the big difference was that we had the 100% support of the Vice-Chancellor. So George was fantastic. He had an open door. He was prepared to listen to any issues that we raised with him. And he came to our events and he spoke at them. He gave them status and stature. And people then accepted this was a serious movement. And I think without that support, I mean, it helped enormously for the women of Queen's that Senior Pro-Chancellor, as was then, was chairing this new movement. It gave credibility to it, and it gave them confidence to believe that it might actually achieve something and something might happen, which of course it did. And that's when, as you know, we all know the beginnings of what was the Women's Forum merged into the Queen's Gender Initiative. And I always remember the meeting in one of the old committee rooms where we were having quite a complicated discussion about, look, how do we start making a difference, and what do you think our priorities should be? And all of us instinctively were thinking, probably childcare, you know, that's what's holding most women back. And the more we talked about it, the more we realised we didn't know what we were talking about. So we decided, look, we need to ask the women of Queen's what their priorities are. We can't second guess, because we are not in a position to judge their lives. And that was the start of the listening exercises, where we invited faculty by faculty in first instance, and then moving through all layers of staff in the university, inviting women to come along and talk about what they thought, fill in questionnaires. And for the first time, most of those women were coming into the centre of the university, into this room, for the first time ever in their lives. They'd never been in the heart of the university before. They met colleagues that they didn't know. They had conversations amongst themselves. They began to network and waken up, and it was like a spring awakening. It was absolutely wonderful. And then, of course, George, in his wholehearted way, said, I am prepared to give you £20,000 to initiate an international art competition. And we all know where that finished, with this amazing portrait behind, this amazing triptych behind us of women emerging from the shadows. So from small beginnings, it was almost like a rolling stone gathering moss. You know, it took off, and it went in so many different directions. And obviously the more successful we became, the higher our profile, the more women came to join us. And we had the most amazing group of women supporting Women's Forum. And I have to say, men. I was surprised at the support that we got from the men of the university. But I have to say that while being Pro-Chancellor made a difference, it couldn't have been a difference without the 100% support of the Vice-Chancellor. We were so lucky to have Sir George Bain leading the university at that time. It was wonderful. And
really the intervention and the involvement of the Vice-Chancellor, Sir George Bain, was a catalyst.
Yes.
Where you went from 9 people who were interested but maybe a little bit unsure would this work, became the hundreds of women who took part in the listening exercise.
Yes.
And of the many thousands of women over 21 years who have been impacted by the work that was credible, was supported, and was championed.
Yes. No. I mean, I think we had so many champions across the university. You know, we identified eventually individual champions for each area, and they themselves became powerful voices for the QGI. They were local voices. They were people that, you know, staff locally could come and access, because people were still a little bit shy about contacting the heart of the university, because it was something that they had really no positive connection with. But through the development of the mentoring scheme, more than anything, that was the one thing. Promotion, of course, emerged as the big issue that women felt they needed support and help with more than anything. Childcare came, I can't remember the order, but it was well down the list. You know, people had tended to make their own arrangements, but probably the fact that women's careers quite often had to halt because they were looking after family and had family responsibilities. Getting over that hump was huge, and the mentoring program brought women together, you know, senior women mentoring junior women, advising them on how they might progress. But not just that, they were usually from different disciplines within the university, would never have met, and the two cultures met, and quite often they worked collaboratively as a result of the mentoring program. So there were all kinds of offshoots from what began as quite a simple idea but emerged as a wonderful evolutionary process within the university across the women. In fact, it was so good that we used to get complaints from male colleagues saying, can we not have a mentoring programme? They wanted one all by themselves. I'm not sure if that ever happened, but it was great.
It's certainly the case that the QGI mentoring programme has a reputation of having impact.
Yeah.
Sometimes the impacts are private. It's about work-life balance. It's about the childcare, the taking time out, and it's a lot about conversations that will eventually lead to a promotion or a career progression.
Yes.
And that sharing of knowledge and sharing of experience among the women of Queen's who would not normally have met each other. It's just wonderful that QGI has been able to make that happen.
Yes, and I think
for the women in Queen's.
One of the things that I think was most noticeable was the fact that women for the first time were encouraged by colleagues who had perhaps followed a similar path to apply for promotion. Most women were afraid to do it because they thought, I only tick 5 out of the 7 boxes, so I can't possibly do that. Instead of which, they were able to talk to someone who said, no, here's what you can do and here's how you can get around that, and don't be afraid to apply. And I'm not sure what the rate of applications was initially, but I do know that when we started, there were 15 female professors at Queen's and there were well over 200 male professors. That was the proportion. It was shocking, absolutely shocking. We'll probably hear what the relative proportions are now, but they're certainly not that. And I'm happy to say that in Senate, I gather it's a pretty even balance between women and men now, thankfully. The skills and professionalism of women are identified and used just as much as male colleagues. So it's a different world now, and it's wonderful to see.
It's a world that is quite different from how it was 21 years ago. It's taken 21 years for that to happen. Yeah. And I guess the time that it takes for one to go through the academic career structure, that's commensurate with 10 years or 20 years, but we don't take it for granted. No. And it wouldn't have happened without possibly that question that you had asked, but also the work of people who maybe were struggling to have a voice, and the coincidence of a very engaged Vice-Chancellor, champions throughout the university who became really a structural glue, holding the network and the hearts and minds together. And I think we can see the benefits that has been in the lives of people and the careers they've chosen. And
also women became less worried about challenging and asking questions. I think it gave them the confidence to move forward and to make a difference. I mean, I had an honorary position, so I wasn't employed by the university, and someone like me wasn't afraid to ask the awkward question because they couldn't sack me. But I could see where a junior academic or even a middle-ranking academic would be worried about shaking things up in case it would affect their career prospects. So they were, initially, not subsequently, but initially, very dependent on people who were able to carry forward the whole programme and to ask the awkward questions and to be a pain in the backside, if you like, of people who didn't really want to have this, new sort of whole movement, which turned around the existing culture of Queen's, because effectively we were about changing culture as much as about promoting the position of women in Queen's. I mean, Karen, that certainly when I started Queen's, there was one portrait of a woman in the Great Hall, and there were 60, I think, or maybe 80, I've lost track of the number. All the others were men, all looking much the same. And it was certainly one of Margaret Mullet's inspired ideas that we could begin by changing the face of Queen's officially and beginning to introduce female portraits. And that was the start of another journey, which, as you know, has been wonderfully successful. But it's been an integral part of the progress that we've made, where QGI became the voice of women and of other colleagues in Queen's who maybe didn't have either the audience or the opportunity to talk about things that were important, and having their voices amplified or more senior colleagues speaking on their behalf. I think that the ethos of QGI is still very much serving our community and promoting visibility of women, either in this portrait or the portraits in the Great Hall, on boards around the university, and really
enhancing both the voice and the face of women in Queens has, I think, provided an opportunity for people to speak up who may not have felt there was the environment or the culture that you referenced to do that.
No, it's completely revolutionised how the university looks internally and externally. I like to think, it has changed so much. But it has been an evolutionary process. It didn't happen overnight. And, I think you have to remember that looking now at what Queen's is and the exemplar that it is, and the fact that it's a model for many universities. I'm not sure how many others, equivalent institutions, for instance, have an equivalent number of women portraits on their walls, to quote, even just to reference one single point. And I know that Queen's is an area where people would come to for advice. Other universities and so on would ask for advice on how did you get there, and what can we do differently that might work for us that has worked so well for you. And
I think it's been important for Queen's to share both the hearts and minds piece, and also some of the structural barriers that we've identified. We've called them out, we've dismantled many of those, and we have been able to share what we've learned, the missteps along the way. The mistakes, we all make them. As you say, it takes time to bring about a sustainable change. And I think that's what QGI has been about. It's been about making a change that is worthwhile and that lasts. So Brenda, we've been looking back over 21 years of QGI and how it all began and some of the lessons learned along the way. I wonder if you could share one piece of advice with us that you wish you had known back then.
I think probably I would say, don't be afraid to think big and have a big vision, because initially we were tied up in knots over the small steps that we were taking and focusing on, like if we can do this then we could do that. And although we did have long-term recommendations, we weren't really thinking about them. We were trying to get across different short-term milestones. And I would say, don't worry, think big, because the small steps will lead to the big vision, and you can do it. Anybody.
That's very wise words indeed, Brenda. I think as we go through our professional lives and also what we're doing in QGI, we'll remember to think big, and the steps along the way will take care of themselves.
They will.
Thank you so much, Lady Brenda, for sharing your reflections with us.
Thank you for inviting me back. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.